I was tasked, and I spent 3 days gathering material. It happened to be at a time when a lot was happening on this topic. And it's been my privilege to do a sermon here in Laguna Beach about 6 times, but this is the first time. There's so much to cover. I can't use any of my favorite quotes or asides. I've just got to do it. And you may hesitate at the beginning, but you'll see that, as Dave indicated, we can hope things will turn out all right if we put our shoulder to the wheel, just as in the story. More than a century ago, Sierra Club founder John Muir said, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it is hitched to everything else in the universe." A principle of Unitarian Universalism is respect for the independent web of existence. And these thoughts refer to one thing, the same thing. What is at stake has suddenly become vastly greater. It is nothing less than the continuation of life on earth as we have known it. I'll begin with where things stand today. Then I'll focus on what is most likely to happen in this century. And I'll conclude with what humankind can do to bring about the most sustainable outcome. This is going to be a journey from darkness to light. We cannot know what is required of us unless we know what we are facing. That is the dark part. We cannot respond fully unless we call upon our great capacity to do so. That is when the light comes. Where do things stand today? Climate change is best defined as the increasing frequency of extreme weather events. Such calamities were once considered freakish, but are now commonplace. California provides multiple examples. Heat. There's a clear trend for each year to be the hottest on record. The Friday after the 4th of July this year, Mission Viejo hit 113 degrees. Every part of the state has had unprecedented heat at one or more points in the last 3 years. Drought. The Colorado River Basin has been stuck in drought since 2000. A shortage declaration has loomed over the 7-state basin for more than a decade, only to be narrowly averted by rain and snow in the upper basin. But this year, flows into the river's 2 massive reservoirs fell to little more than a third of average through July and to 1% of normal in September. A shortage could be declared as early as 2020, result of the deepening long-term drought cycle. The trigger is the water level at Lake Mead, which is only 38% full. A declared shortage would reduce water allocations. In California, every year save one since 2011 has been a drought year. 2016 was rated the driest in 500 years with no Sierra snowpack. Then in 2017, Northern California had its wettest year on record, a sign of weather instability. Fire. Of the state's 20 largest recorded fires, 14 have occurred since 2000. The 2006 Cedar Fire was a record 273,000 acres, but was eclipsed in 2017 by the Thomas Fire, 282,000, and the very next year, this year, by the Mendocino Fire at 345,000 acres. Extreme heat creates tinder dry vegetation that is ready to explode. 2017 and 2018 showed this impact matters more than how much rain or snow fell the previous winter. Our recent fires generated such heat that they created their own weather. Fire whirls snapped and hurled trees. Flame fingers struck firefighters a football field's distance from the fire's edge. And fire vortexes formed searing pyrocumulus clouds that generated gale-force windstorms. Experts predict that if the current rate of climate change continues, By the middle of the century, fires will burn twice as much acreage as today. Natural environments, and we're still talking California. Since 1970, water at Lake Tahoe and other freshwater bodies is warming 10 times the previous rate. Sierra Nevada glaciers are quickly retreating. On average, they've lost 70% of their area since 1900, with half of that since 1970. California has an estimated 129 million dead trees attacked by bark beetles and weakened by drought. They succumbed. Most of these are in the Sierra Nevada. Other climate change impacts fall outside our region. For example, hurricanes. Warmer air holds more water vapor. And last year, Hurricane Harvey dropped more water than any storm in the history of our country, 60 inches in parts of Houston. MIT scientists estimate Harvey was made 6 times more likely by the rise in human greenhouse gases. This year, Hurricane Florence broke every rainfall record on the East Coast. Burning fossil fuels plus deforestation creates an energy imbalance on the planet. About 90% of the excess energy does not end up in the air. It's stored in the ocean down to a depth of 6,000 feet. Tropical storms draw their energy from this store of heat. Warmer oceans mean more intense and longer lasting storms. Sea level rise is caused not only by the melting of glaciers, but by water expanding as it warms. Higher seas mean storms reach further inland, with warmer air that holds more moisture and adds to rainfall. Weather patterns also change because the poles are warming faster than the mid-latitudes, and the thermal difference between them is diminishing, which reduces the velocity of the jet stream. That means the weather it carries can stay in one place longer, adding to the severity of extreme weather events. That's why these hurricanes park themselves like they've been. Beyond the regions are national and global impacts. Climate change has the unfortunate effect of intensifying extremes. The northern half of the U.S. has become much wetter, and the southern half has become much drier. The U.S. has nearly 36 regional hotspots of water insecurity. Great Plains farmland and California's Central Valley feed the U.S. and the world. But they are hotspots where groundwater is being rapidly depleted, pumped at an unsustainable level to irrigate crops and raise livestock. The same is true in northwestern India and the North China Plain, where pumping has increased in response to drought and population growth. Water insecurity has always mobilized populations. Changing water availability has the potential to generate waves of millions of future climate refugees. Warming. A new UN report, the first in-depth assessment since the Paris Accords, predicts that devastating effects of climate change will hit harder and decades sooner than previously expected. If greenhouse gas emissions continue unabated, the atmosphere will warm almost 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2040, and that's 3 degrees centigrade. I'll get to that in a moment. This could mean reaching a tipping point of irreversible impacts in only a dozen years. Wildlife habitat. Another new analysis finds the species risk to plants and animals would be twice as great from a 2-degree increase as a 1.5-degree increase. The study also looked at what would happen if the world warms 3 degrees by 2100. That's what's projected to occur if those who signed the Paris Accord meet their pledges to reduce emissions by 2030 and then do nothing more. In that event, 44% of plants and 26% of vertebrates would see more than half their geographic range disappear. 2 technical notes. One is it's remarkable how small changes in temperature can have big effects. And secondly, all these reports are in Celsius, which every degree is twice the size of a degree in Fahrenheit. Environmental justice. Many emerging economies took the new UN report as jarring but expected. The director of India's Center for Science and the Environment said the panel's prognosis is grim. The World Bank estimates rising temperatures and changing monsoons could reduce economic output in India by 2050 and affect the living standards of 600 million Indians living in hotspots. The global cost of productivity lost to heat has been estimated at $2 trillion by 2030. India was once seen as a spoiler in world climate talks because its priority was economic development. But in recent years, it has set ambitious targets for fossil fuel reduction and installation of solar power. Although China is now the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, America and Europe emitted an estimated 1/3 to 40% of the global total between 1850 and 2012, compared to, for example, 0.5% for the Philippines. This disparity has triggered calls for wealthy countries to help poorer ones deal with the effects of climate change. Western countries grew wealthy on a carbon-heavy diet of industrial development. To honor the Paris Agreement, they must help poorer places abate future emissions without sacrificing the growth needed to leave poverty behind. Politicians must ensure that the most vulnerable do not bear the brunt of change. Now, the impact of current commitments. Today, humans put 52 billion tons of global warming fuel into the air each year, projected to rise to 59 billion in 2030. Pledges to the Paris Accords put the Earth on a course for 3 degrees of warming. The latest UN report calls for keeping these impacts below 1 degree compared to the current cap of slightly under 2. Temperatures have already risen almost 2 degrees since the Industrial Revolution began. William Nordhaus just won the Nobel Prize for his work on climate change economics. He says, if world leaders would agree to limit human-caused warming to less than 1 degree rather than the current goal of less than 2, half as many people would lack water, fewer people would die or get sick from heat, smog, and infectious diseases. There would be fewer heat waves, downpours, and droughts. 3 years after the Paris Accords, greenhouse gases are up, as are investments in oil and gas. In 2017, for the first time in 4 years, the use of coal rose. Energy demand in Asia's emerging economies grew by 40% between 2006 and 2016. Coal generates 80% of India's electricity, and its use climbed by more than 3% a year. China has 1 million plus electric cars, but they depend on a grid that is 2/3 coal-powered. And as a result, use of these EVs produces more CO2 than some fuel-efficient gas models. Famed climate change scientist Bill McKibben says, the political problem is not confined to America, which produces more fossil fuels than any other country. Russia comes in second and Saudi Arabia third, and they are utterly dependent on oil revenues. The few places where the message has been heard, like California and Norway, are outliers, and outliers are not enough. And now the next section is titled Moving Toward the Light. And you know, it's the first time I've actually read this stuff out loud, and I can't restrain myself from quoting Woody Allen's take on a presentation like this. This is the opening line from his speech to the graduates. He says, more than at any time in human history, humankind stands at a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to complete destruction. We pray for the wisdom to choose correctly. Well, let's move toward the light. And I'm going to open that with the words of Dave Weber, my good friend. I always love working with Dave. He said to me when we were talking about this, we were on the phone and I wrote this down. The technical solutions are out there, but we must resolve to use them. And Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, says, the UN report brings scientific proof that we have everything we need to combat climate change, but everyone has to act now. The UN report urges steps that are technically feasible, but they would involve rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, including energy, transport, land use, and urban planning. Here's a menu of responses. First of all, government regulation. Carbon reduction targets are vital, and California is in the lead with a 2045 deadline for transition to zero carbon electricity and a year 2030 goal of carbon emissions that are 40% below what they were in 1990. Those are the most aggressive goals in the nation. Taxing carbon is a means to reach this goal. William Nordhaus, the father of climate change economics, believes carbon taxes are the most efficient way of balancing the economic costs and social benefits. By using a tax rather than regulations, governments can encourage companies to find innovative ways to reduce pollution and thereby reduce their tax burden. Around 70 countries and regions responsible for 1/5 of all emissions now price carbon. Then there's government innovation. A survey by the 100 Resilient Cities Consortium found that climate change ranked only behind inequality and aging infrastructure as a concern. The group estimates that investment in energy-efficient technology could create 14 million new jobs and prevent 1.3 million premature pollution-related deaths a year by 2030. Char Miller, director of the Pomona College Environmental Analysis Program, asks, what's next for water in California? He says climate change is the top culprit, but so are slow-moving plans to capture fast-moving storm water on its way to the ocean and store it in aquifers, sponge-like areas where water runoff is stored naturally in the ground. And Miller says we need to collaborate to ignore political boundaries just as nature ignores them. He lauds Orange County, whose water treatment plant is perhaps the world's largest, cleaning 100 million gallons a day for domestic use. And even with our 3 million residents, 2/3 of our total water use goes to outdoor landscaping. In this year's Sierra Club ranking of the coolest, most green colleges in America, UC Irvine rated #1, thanks to net zero emission housing construction and a pioneering project which converts campus-generated solar power into hydrogen that is injected into the campus gas supply, creating a partially decarbonizing effect. Experts praise California's response to climate change thus far, but they note that the state could be investing more in research on battery storage of renewable energy and capture of carbon from the atmosphere. Romer, who just won the Nobel Prize, observes that unregulated economies have generally failed to do enough to support R&D, along with patent policies that provide profits to investors while allowing others to put their innovations to work. Optimists say decarbonization, scrubbing CO2 from the atmosphere, is within reach. Solar geoengineering is exploring ways to reflect sunlight back into space. In the words of the late columnist Joseph Kraft, when technology creates a problem, apply more technology. Now, we know we can't count on that, but there's quite a repertoire out there. How about private sector responses? Al Gore won the Nobel Prize as an early voice warning of climate change impacts. He went on to become co-founder of Generation Investment Management, which today has $20 billion in assets. And Gore says this: we look for companies that don't borrow from the future, that help create a more sustainable and healthier present, without doing so at the expense of opportunities that should be available down the road. Now, the final focus I want to touch on is our individual responses in terms of political activism and personal conservation. Bill McKibben, the the great climate change scientist, calls for climate disobedience. And he says, quote, "Much of what progress has been made toward mitigating climate change has come largely through protest. Protest has weakened the very industry that has made political progress on climate change all but impossible. It is the long campaign of deceit and denial by the oil industry that is responsible above all for our government's inaction." Final focus. The top Sierra Club priority for next year is to achieve ambitious and just climate solutions. And toward that end, they put out a fair share research paper that spells out lifestyle changes we can make as individuals. And here's the illustration. The minimal lifestyle change reduces our CO2 output by 20 to 25%. Just imagine an individual home. Reducing vehicle miles driven by 20%, omitting 1/3 of airplane flights, changing thermostat settings to make them less extreme with the season, changing lights to LED, reducing hot water use and electric use. And Dave is admirable. I asked him the other day, "You still save the shower water until it warms up?" And he said, yes, he does. So that's a good example. And then there's a moderate strategy, 40 to 45% greenhouse gas reduction from the baseline. Upgrade your vehicle to a hybrid or EV with 50 miles per gallon equivalent. Double the level of reductions just described, and decrease consumer spending by 40%. And I should have said, number one, minimal, decrease consumer spending by 20%. Okay, so ambitious is a 70 to 75% decrease in your household output of CO2. Add rooftop solar for 100% of residential energy. Make further reductions in baseline levels. Decrease consumer spending by 70%. A couple of notes. By far the largest, and I should mention, cutting out beef is part of the strategy. In fact, even at the minimal level, it calls for 50% reduction in beef consumption. And it's amazing that in world landfills, by far the largest source of waste is food waste. So that gets a lot of emphasis. And among foods, beef has unique greenhouse gas impacts. And in this regard, it's worth noting that even with our almost 40 million people in California, 70% or more of all water use is by agriculture. Regarding consumer spending, if your baseline is already below normal, you can adjust further reductions accordingly. One of my favorite sayings is from Buddhism. Want what you have. Desire what you already possess. Next time you want to go on a shopping spree, that is a good thought. Economist Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize this year for studying why some economies grow faster than others. He says, many people think dealing with protecting the environment will be so costly and so difficult, they want to ignore the problem. Yet human beings are capable of amazing accomplishments when we set about trying to do something. But the time is now. Amen.